Hello and welcome to another section of this complete Angular course. So far in this course, whenever we have created a new Angular project, we were saving the data in the browser's memory. We have not worked with servers and stored data in the database yet. So till now, we have been saving the data in the browser's memory and not in any kind of database. For example, whenever we created a list like user list or course list, we were using array for that. And that array was getting saved in the browser's memory. Now, when we save our data in the browser's memory, every time we restart or refresh our Angular application, the new data which we have pushed to the array that will be lost. And we are left with the initial state of our Angular application. So for example, let's say initially when this component is getting rendered, there we are creating this users property. And initially in this users property, we have two elements. And we are displaying those two elements here in the web page. Now, whenever a user clicks on this add user button, we are calling this on save click method, and there we are pushing that new user to that users array using this push method. So when this button will be clicked, a new user will be added and it will be displayed in the web page. Again, when this button will be clicked, again a new user will be added and it will be displayed in the web page. Now, if I go ahead and if I restart the application or if I refresh the Angular application, in that case, again, the component will be initialized. This users property will be created. And initially in this users property, we will have only two elements. So in the web page, again, we will only see two users. So the last two users which we added, that is gone. And this is what happens when we save the data in the browser's memory. And that's why when we are creating a real world application, we are not saving the data in the browser's memory or in the system's memory. Instead, we save the data in a database. And when we save our data in the database, even when the Angular application restarts or refreshes, since the data is present in the database, it still persists in that database, and our Angular application can access that data from that database and show it in the UI. So typically, when we create a real-world application, we communicate with the backend server and save our application data in a database. Then, in order to use that data, we make an HTTP request to the server where the database is present, and we fetch the data from the database and use it in our application. So, in this section, you're going to learn how we can communicate with backend server from our Angular application. You will also learn how to transform the response data according to your need and use it in your Angular application. Alright, so the question is how we can communicate with a database residing on a remote server and fetch data from that database and use it in our Angular application. Before we learn that, a very important point you need to keep in mind is that we should never connect to a database from our Angular application directly. In order to connect to a database, we need to provide the login credentials for that database like username and password. So if we try to connect to a database from our Angular application, then we will have to pass the credentials from our Angular application. That means we will have to store the database credentials in our Angular application. But as we already know, Angular is simply a JavaScript framework for developing client-side applications. And since it is at the end a JavaScript code, anyone can inspect the source code of your Angular application in the browser and read the database credentials. And this will make your Angular application highly insecure because any user can read the database credentials from your Angular application. And that's why we do not use database credentials in our Angular application. And so we do not directly connect to the database from our Angular application. Now the question is, if we do not store database credentials in our Angular application and if we do not connect to a database from our Angular application directly, then how do we work with database from an Angular application? Because we certainly don't want to develop a standalone Angular application which is not connected to any kind of database, right? So what we can do is, from our Angular application, instead of directly connecting to a database, we can use an API. In this case, we send an HTTP request from our Angular application to an API, and this API will then fetch the data from the database or create, update, or delete a record in the database based on what type of request we are sending. And then the API will send back the response to the Angular application with the requested data. and then we can use that data in our Angular application. Now, the database credentials will be stored in the API code, which is also present on the server. In this way, we are not directly connecting to a database. Instead, we are communicating with an API, which in turn communicate with the database and returns us the data. This API can be REST API or GraphQL API or any other type of API. In this course, we will work with REST APIs, which is the most common form of API you can work with. You can think of an API almost like a web application. Just like a web application, an API also has a URL, and based on the URL we type, it sends us some response. But here, the response is not HTML like we get from a normal web application. Instead, API sends us JSON response, which can be later transformed into a JavaScript object and can be used in the front-end application. Also, always remember that Angular is used to create front-end application. We do not use Angular for creating APIs. To create APIs, we use server-side languages like Python, Node, or PHP, etc. But we can certainly use Angular to communicate with APIs. And the API will contain the code to interact with the database, like fetching the data, deleting the data from the database, updating or inserting the data in the database, etc. So in this course, we are not going to create any API from scratch because for that, we will have to learn one of the server-side languages, and that is out of the scope of this course. So to learn how to make HTTP request and handle responses from an Angular application, we are going to use a free online service provided by Google called as Firebase. And this service can of course be replaced by any backend service you have created using a server-side programming language. Alright, now before we start sending the HTTP request to the server, let's have a brief overview of how the HTTP request works. An HTTP request is made up of some core parts which is important to understand. Once we understand it, it will be easy to work with HTTP requests and responses. So the most important part of an HTTP request is the URL to which we are sending the request. So if we are making an HTTP request to an API, in that case, the URL is also called as API endpoint. And an API endpoint looks something like this. So here we have a domain name slash some route parameters. As you can see, this URL looks like just a URL of a website. But here, since it is an API URL, it is not going to return us an HTML. It is going to return us some JSON data. Now, the exact path of an API endpoint depends on the API we are working with. So, in order to make an HTTP request to the server, first we need a URL for that API. And we also call it as API endpoint. Then, the second important part of an HTTP request is the HTTP verb. So, when communicating with the RESTful APIs, it's not just the URL which matters, but also the HTTP verb we are using. HTTP verb defines which type of request you want to send to the API endpoint and what we actually want to do with the request. For example, we have different types of HTTP verbs like get, post, put, delete, etc. And each of these HTTP verbs does different things. For example, if you want to fetch data from the server, you make a get request. So in that case, the HTTP verb will be get. But if you want to create a new record in the database, then we send a post request to the server. And with the post request, we also send the body, the data with which we want to create a record on the server. In the same way, if you want to update a record in the database, we use either put or patch HTTP verb. And if you want to delete a record from the database, we use delete HTTP verb. So the URL endpoint and the HTTP verb are the two most important parts of an HTTP request. Now, when making HTTP requests to the server, along with API endpoint and HTTP verbs, we also need to send some additional metadata to the server with the request we are sending. These metadata are called as headers of the request. In most cases, the headers of the request are set by the client which we are using to send the request. And hence, in most of the cases, we do not need to set the headers explicitly when making an HTTP request. For example, when we send an HTTP request to the server from a browser, in that case, the browser is the client. So before sending request, browser will set some headers for that request. But it is also possible to set headers for a request manually from our Angular application. And we will see that practically in this section. Finally, for some of the HTTP verbs, we also need to specify the body, that is, the data which we want to send with the request. For example, when we want to create a new product in the database, we will have to send the details of that product with the request to the server. And based on the data which we are sending, a new product will be created. If we do not send any data with the request, the server will not know what record to be created. So a body is nothing but the data which we want to send with the request. Now, not all the request needs to have a body. HTTP requests like post, put, patch, etc. they need to have a body. But HTTP requests like GET, they do not need to have a body. And we will understand this practically in the coming lectures. Alright, so this was a very brief overview of HTTP request. When we make an HTTP request to the server, we need to have a URL, an endpoint to which we want to make the request. We also need to specify what type of request we are making by setting the HTTP verb like get, post, put, delete, etc. If we want, we can also set some headers explicitly for the HTTP request which we are sending. But if we don't set any headers for the HTTP request, then the client will automatically set some default headers for that request. And finally, based on the type of request we are sending, based on the HTTP verb we are using for making the HTTP request, we might also need to specify the body for that request. If a request is a post request or put request or patch request, in that case, with that request, we also need to send some body. All right. Now keep in mind that we can manipulate HTTP requests from our client application and what it should contain. But as a front-end developer, we do not have any control over what a response will look like and what data it will contain. A response comes from the server. So response can be manipulated only by the backend developers while writing the server-side code. So the server-side code is responsible for sending us the response. So as a front-end developer, we don't have control over the HTTP response and we cannot manipulate it. But a server-side developer, a backend developer who is defining what type of response they are going to send to the client, they can control how the response will look like. But for a front-end developer, he can only modify the HTTP request and not HTTP response. All right. Now, as we learned, using HTTP requests, we are going to create records in the database and we are going to fetch data from the database and update and delete it. We also learned that we don't use Angular to create a backend solution like creating an API or writing server-side code. Angular is a front-end development framework which we use to create UI of an application. But we can of course make an HTTP request to the server or an API using Angular. Now, to create backend solutions like an API or writing some server-side code, we use server-side programming languages like Node.js, PHP, Python, etc. But that is out of the scope of this course. So what we are going to do is we are going to use an existing backend solution which is provided by Google and it is called as Firebase. Using Firebase, we can create NoSQL databases and it also generates API endpoints to work with that database. And we'll understand it in a bit. And Firebase is the best service we can use to learn about HTTP requests and responses in Angular. If we use Firebase, we will not have to manually create any database or an API by writing some code. And Firebase is free to get started with and we can send different types of requests there and we can easily see the changes which we make through these requests. So as a first step of this section, let's go ahead and let's create a database in Firebase, which is a service provided by Google. Let's open web browser and there let's search for Firebase and you can click on this first link. All right, now we are at this web page. The next thing which we need to do here is we need to log into Firebase by using our Google credentials. Here I am already logged in, so I don't need to log in. But if you're not logged in, then first you will have to log in using your Google credentials and then you can proceed further. Now what we want is in Firebase, we want to create a new project. For that, we can click on this Get Started button. And here you can see, I already have two projects, React HTTP tutorial and Angular by Procademy. Now I'm going to create a new project here by clicking on this add project button. Here, let's provide a name for the project. Okay, let's click on this continue button. Here, let's go ahead and let's disable this checkbox. So we don't want to enable Google Analytics for this project. Okay, and let's go ahead and let's click on this create project button. And now it is going to create this new project for us. So our new project is ready. Let's click on the continue button. So here you can see my project name is Angular HTTP client. So this project has been created. Now again, remember that Firebase is not just a database. It is a complete backend solution which also provides database, and it also provides API endpoints to work with that database. So here now our project is ready, and in this project we are going to create a new database. For that, let's expand this build section. There we want to create a real-time database. So we will select this option. Now here, let's click on this create database button. Now here, we need to select a location where we want our server to be created. Here I'm going to keep this default value. So the database which I'm going to create, it will be created on a server situated in United States. But if you want, you can also select another option. So here we have these three options: United States, Belgium, and Singapore. So whichever location you will select, the database will be created in the server which is situated in that location. Again, I'm going to keep the default one, United States. I'll click on this next button. And here we have two options to start with. So it says start in logged mode and start in test mode. Here we are going to select start in test mode. That's because currently we are creating a dummy Angular application to learn about HTTP request and response from Angular. Here, we do not want to add any authentication or authorization for our Angular application. So we are going to create our database in the test mode. Normally, when we create a real-world application, there we want to protect our data from unauthorized users. So there we should never select test mode. But here we are selecting test mode because we want to interact with the database without authenticating ourselves. Later, we will also learn about authentication and authorization and how to authenticate ourselves to access the data in the database. For now, we do not want to worry about authentication and authorization. That's why we are selecting test mode. Now click on this enable button, and in this way we have created a database. Currently, this database is empty. It does not contain any collections, any tables. The only thing which you can see here currently is this URL, and it is this URL which will work as an endpoint to work with this database which we have just created. So when we will create new collections in this database, to work with that collection, we will need an endpoint. And this URL here, it will be the part of that endpoint. So we are going to work with this database from our next lecture. And in order to work with this database, we are going to use this endpoint in our Angular application. So here, our database is ready. Now all we need to do is we need to create records in this database and access those records from our Angular application, which we are going to start doing from our next lecture. Now, before we wrap up this lecture, there are few points I want to clear about Firebase database. A database can be classified into two types. We have relational database and we have NoSQL database. In a relational database, we have database, and in the database we have tables, and each tables will have rows. Each row represents an entity, for example, a product, a customer, a user, etc. And each row will have columns which stores data related to that entity. For example, here we have a user table, and each row here represents a user. And in each row we have some columns which stores the details about that user. For example, that user's ID, user's name, user's gender, and the type of subscription user is using. Now, in a NoSQL database, we do not have tables. Instead, we have collections. And each collection consists of documents. And a document is nothing but a JSON object. So here you can see in this example, we have two documents. Here we have the first document and this one is the second document. And as I mentioned, a document is nothing but a JSON object. And in the document, we will have fields. So this ID here is a field, This name here is a field, gender is field, type is field, okay? And a field consists of key value pairs. So the ID is key and its value is 101. Name is key, John Smith is its value. Okay, so in a NoSQL database, instead of tables, we have collections. Instead of rows, we have documents. And instead of columns, we have fields. Now, Firebase, it is not a relational database. It is a NoSQL database. So when we will create new records in the database, which we have created in Firebase, those records will be stored as a JSON data. Instead of storing the data in a table, the data will be stored in a collection in the form of JSON object. So keep in mind that Firebase is a NoSQL database. It is not a relational database. It is a NoSQL database. All right. So this is all from this lecture. From the next lecture, let's start learning how to work with HTTP requests and responses from our Angular application.